next lecture. We are about to start chapter 60 of part 1, which in the Pines edition is page 143. And we started with, the last couple of weeks, we've been discussing the Rambam's idea of negative attributes. So, and why we can't describe God positively in any way. And he said that, just a quick reminder, he said, anytime the Torah uses a term that is a description of God, it means one of two things. Either it is a description of an action that we experience, right? In other words, we experience an action that seems like kindness or seems like power and strength. So therefore God is described that way, but it doesn't mean that God actually has that attribute. And the second understanding would be that it's a way, it's kind of a directional, it's bringing us towards the direction of understanding the greatness and of God. So that, like, if it says God is powerful or great or large or mighty or some great word like that, it doesn't mean that he actually can be described that way. It just wants to tell us that he's, you know, it brings us in that direction. It brings us in the direction towards him. So, but however, we should only use the terms, as he said, that are used in the Torah by the prophets. And when we pray, we should be careful only to use the terms that were specifically given to us by the prophets to say in our prayers. But in general, we have to use his idea of negative attributions. Now, so now he's going to go a little bit more on that subject. He's going to delve into it deeper and try to describe to us why this is so important. I'm going to try to start video and see if maybe it gets better.
Oh, yeah, fine.
All right, now you can actually see me. Okay. So wait, maybe not, I don't know. I'll bounce back and forth.
I think the message is that maybe, like God, we shouldn't be seeing you, we should just be hearing you.
Okay, fine. So be it. Anyway, I'll try again in a little bit, but let's get going in chapter 60. So I wish to tell you, Rambam tells us in this chapter, parables by means of which, and parables sometimes means what we would commonly think of as a parable, you know, a little story, or sometimes a parable in Rambam's terms just means another way of describing, you know, giving us an example or something that helps us understand what he's trying to describe. So parables by means of which you will be able to add to your representation of the necessity to multiply his attributes by means of negations. In other words, I'm going to explain to you why it's so important to understand God to describe him by means of negations, and also to add to your shrinking from the belief. I want to reinforce the idea that I've been saying, that you should not use positive attributes regarding him, may he be exalted. So his example is, assume that a man has acquired true knowledge regarding the existence of a ship. The guy knows there's a ship, okay? But he does not know to what it is that this term is applied. In other words, somebody told him there's such a thing as a ship, and that's all he knows. He doesn't know, is the ship a substance or an accident? Meaning, is it a thing, or is it an accident, meaning a quality of a thing, right? So a thing would be, for example, a bottle, right? And a quality of a thing would be a cold or hot, you know, or large or small, etc. Then it became clear to some other individual that the ship is not an accident. In other words, it's not but rather it's an actual thing, right? But all that person found out is that it's not a descriptor, it's not an adjective, but rather it's a noun. So that's all that the second guy knows. So the first guy just knows the term. The second guy knows that it's referring to an actual object. Afterwards, it became clear to yet another individual. Another guy figured out that it is not a mineral, or what we would call today an element, or in some translations, this comes out as a metal, but whatever. It's not an element. So it's not whatever, gold, copper, whatever. Then it became clear to someone else that it is not a living being. Okay, so now this last person here, the person that we're up to right now, knows a whole bunch of stuff. He knows it's not a description, it's not an accident. He knows it's not an element. He knows that it's not a living creature. Okay, so it's an object Then it became clear to someone else that it is not a plant forming a continuum with earth. It's not a plant. It doesn't grow from the ground. Okay. Then it becomes clear to someone else that it is not one body naturally forming a continuum, right? In other words, it's made up of components. Then it became clear to someone else that it does not possess a simple shape as do tables and doors. It's not like a square or a circle. So it's a complex object. Then it became clear to someone else that it is not a sphere, and to another individual that it is not a cone, right? And to yet another individual is not a sphere and does not possess equal sides. So it's not like it's not a box. And to someone else that it is not a solid all through. So it's hollow in the middle. So little by little, the more people are learning about this ship, right? By learning about what it isn't, it is clear the last individual has nearly achieved by means of negative attributes the representation of the ship as it is. Right? By negative attributes, he's come to it's possible for him to learn and figure out that we're talking about a ship, right? He has, as it were, attained equality with one who has represented the ship as being a body. He could have achieved that same understanding of the ship in the opposite way by someone describing it consists of timber, a body that is hollow, it is oblong and composed of a number of pieces of timber. That is, the guy that did it through the negative attributes, he has attained equality with one who's represented the ship by means of affirmative attributes. I just turned the page to 144. We'll try the video one more time. Let's see what happens. Okay, it's lasting for the moment. Okay, so now, no, I'm sorry, it's not worth it. Forget it. So that's what we have here. As for those whom we have cited in the parable as being prior to him, so as we started off with one guy who knew hardly anything. All he knew was that there's something called a ship, right? Every one of them is more remote from representing the ship to himself than the one who comes after him. Each person is farther and farther away from the understanding of the ship. Thus, the first one figuring in our parable knows nothing but the bare term alone. Accordingly, the negative attributes make you come nearer in a similar way to the cognition and apprehension of God, may he be exalted. I'm going to finish this paragraph, and then I'm going to stop, and I want to make a point that I really, it's just one of the most incredible and most powerful thoughts that comes out of this idea. Desire then wholeheartedly that you should know by demonstration some additional thing to be negated, but do not desire to negate merely in words. So if you want to get to learn God, what you really need to have is that desire to learn things, right? Because when you learn, the more you learn about the world around you, the more we understand God, right? Because the more we learn that God is not, right? If you see, for example, a powerful volcanic eruption, it's massive, it's mighty, it's crazy. You hear, God forbid, of a terrible earthquake or something. The power, the awe, the might is spectacular. But God is beyond that. Not just that he's more powerful than that, but his power is something that we can't even comprehend in words. So by achieving knowledge, if you achieve a wonder of something beautiful in the world, something that's incredible how it works, how the molecule, the movements of cells in a body or whatever it is that you're looking at, but God is more than that. It's something that's absolutely beautiful, the most beautiful view you can imagine, but God is beyond that. Is great, is not just greater in magnitude, but greater in a way that we can't even describe, right? For on every occasion on which it becomes clear to you by means of a demonstration that a thing whose existence is thought to pertain to him may be exalted, should rather be negated with reference to him, you undoubtedly come nearer to him by 1 degree. Everything that you learn, and then you think God is beyond that, right? You've just achieved a closer knowledge of God, right? In this respect, there are people who are very near to him. Again, he's answering the question with which he started the last chapter, which was, how could it be that some people know more, are closer to God and know more, and some people know less? And he answered it already, but he's answering it again. And there are others who are extremely far away from him. So not that there is in this matter a local nearness. No, don't make a mistake, because he keeps on using the word near and far, and he wants to correct us. You realize that even when I, Rambam, use the term near and far, I don't mean that there's a distance, like I'm 25 miles away from God and you're 15 miles away from God. No, what I mean is, right, as is thought by those whose mental eyes are blind. Some people think a person who's near to God is on the mountaintop or whatever. He's just close. I'm sorry. Oh, I forgot to mute everybody. I apologize. Let me do that. So understand this well and know it and rejoice therein. This thought should give you something, it should make you feel, remember he told us you should have this desire and be happy, that you'll feel a tremendous amount of happiness when you recognize this idea. For the way has become clear to you by walking, in which you may come near to him, may be exalted. Now you know how to get close to God. Walk accordingly therein, if you so wish. Rambam tells us, go ahead and go in this path, and you will find this incredible amount of joy in this knowledge of God. But I want to drive home this point, because Rambam is famous for being someone who teaches us that our knowledge of the world around us, not just our knowledge of the Torah, is what brings us close to God, right? Rambam didn't just believe that we should learn secular knowledge because we practically need to know things. Rambam understood that the knowledge that we learn about the world around us actually brings us closer to God. What Rambam just told us in this last paragraph is that every single thing we learn and study about the world around us is how we get closer to God. It's an extremely powerful idea. So it takes everything we do in our life, everything we learn about, whether it's about people, whether it's about society, whether it's about history, whether it's art or literature, everything we appreciate, everything we see brings us closer to God. It's an incredibly powerful idea. I'm going to stop for a second if anyone wants to say anything about that before I go to the next paragraph. But I just want you to say, so this idea, which sounded like, you can only understand God through negative attributes, sounds like a very, I don't know, it's before we learned it, it seemed like kind of lame, but the more we see it, how powerful the idea is. Yosef, go ahead.
Just last night I was reading about the plane crash in the Andes in early 70s. And one of the things that it said in the book was that most of the people on that plane never saw snow in their life before. And as a Canadian, I can't even imagine what it's like to, like you said, to describe something that you've never seen, that you've never felt, that you've never experienced. It's so powerful.
Yeah. Yep. And recognizing that God is some thing, and even using the word thing is inappropriate, but I don't have another word, something that we cannot describe. We cannot. Yes, go ahead. Jeff, you wanted to say something?
I want to ask this question, whether what I'm about to read captures the same thought. It was in connection with Rabbi Steinsaltz's introduction to the shorter way, which is his summary of the Tanya. And he says, and I just had occasion to circulate this to some friends on page 16, it says, understandably, the purpose of this profound work in the Tanya was not to impress scholars, but to show Jews that, and here he quotes out of Deuteronomy, the thing is very nigh unto thee, in your mouth and in your heart, to do it. And I'm wondering if this in some way relates to the thing is very near unto you, in your mouth and in your heart, to do it, whether that sort of incorporeal vagueness is, I don't know, do you see any connection there between this and what you just said?
The one thing I see is the idea of the Torah, that's the verse from Deuteronomy, it is near, it is in your heart and mouth, right?
Right.
And that verse, Rambam would say, because our learning and understanding God comes from what we experience directly in the world around us. We're not reaching out for some distant thing and trying to describe it, right? We look at the world around us with everything that's sitting right in front of us now. We get close to God by understanding what's here, right? What's present. And in that sense, yes, I definitely see a connection. So I'm going to go, I'll move on to the next paragraph, but if someone wants to say something, just feel free to stop me, raise your hand and go ahead, okay? So on the other hand, the predication, so that's how beautiful it is when you use the negative attributes. But if you use positive attributes, you're in a real danger zone. Predication of affirmative attributes of him, may he be exalted, is very dangerous. For it has already been demonstrated that anything that we think of as a perfection, right? When we think, we describe that guy, he's so handsome, or he's so strong, or whatever we think of as a compliment to a certain person, right? Even if it existed as pertaining to him, right? In accordance, in other words, that we think of it as a perfection, even if we were describing God that way, by describing him as mighty or strong or whatever. in accordance with the opinion of those who believe in attributes, nevertheless would not belong to the species of perfection that we think of, right? Right? When we say mighty, we already described this in previous chapters, right? That it's not the same kind of might and it's not the same kind of strength that you and I think of when we describe those things, save only by equivocation, right? The only way it would be similar is through using the words, the terms, right? Remember Rambam, when we went through all those chapters where he described terminology, right? So shito fashem, right? An equivocal term is what he's referring to now. Equivocal meaning I can use this term to describe strength, and then we use it to describe God, but it's not the same thing, right? Just as we have made clear. Accordingly, you must of necessity go over to the notion of negation. Once you start describing God with an affirmative attribute, you have to keep reminding yourself, right? The idea of negation, right? That he's not really, right? For if you say that with one knowledge and with this changeless knowledge that has no multiplicity in it, right? For example, like if you're talking about God's knowledge, right? So you say that God's knowledge doesn't change, right? It's one thing, it's knowledge. He knows the multiple and changeable things that are constantly being renewed without any renewal of knowledge in him. While things in this world are constantly changing, a tree grows, a tree falls, a person lives, a person dies, a child is born, a child has a child, the world keeps rolling on. But God's knowledge doesn't change, right? His knowledge of everything is so basically, and that his knowledge of a thing before it has come into being and after it has acquired reality as existence and after it has ceased to exist is one and the same knowledge in which there is no change. So you have clearly stated that he knows with a knowledge that is not like our knowledge. So once you describe God with knowledge, then you have to go ahead and say, well, his knowledge isn't like ours, because you and I, we know something. I know what happened yesterday. I know what's happening now. You know, I don't know what's going to happen tomorrow, but I can look the weather report and get some idea of what might happen tomorrow, right? But I know it in different stages, right? God is not like that, right? God's knowledge doesn't work that way. So it's totally different. Similarly, it follows necessarily that he exists, but not according to the notion of that existence which is in us, right? He doesn't exist in the same way that we exist. Consequently, you resort to negation. So in other words, once you start using affirmations, if you trying to be intellectually honest, you immediately have to go to the negations. Accordingly, you have not arrived at a knowledge of the true reality of an essential attribute, but you have arrived at multiplicity. What you got when you tried to use affirmative descriptions, you ended up with multiplicity. You ended up describing a God that has a knowledge that's different from time to time. And then you had to try to correct yourself. And before you corrected yourself with, if you take negations out, if you don't use negations, you end up describing multiple gods, right? That he is a certain essence possessing unknown attributes. Now, with regard to the attributes that as you deem should be affirmed with reference to him, if you decided that there are certain attributes which we should give him, if you deny that they have a likeness to the attributes known to us, it follows that they do not belong to the same species as the latter. That's reiterating what he just said. Accordingly, the matter of affirmation of attributes has, as it were, withdrawn from you. When you started using attributes, you went steps backwards instead of forwards. Instead of getting closer to understanding God, you got farther. You started saying he has knowledge, but wait, he doesn't have knowledge. His knowledge is not like our knowledge. So what did you just accomplish? You accomplished one of two things. Either you said something and then you had to bring it back and say, no, it's not. Or you said something and you have to force upon to God different things and say that there's different stuff going on. And you're dividing God up into parts, which is a problem, right? Which we'll see in a minute, what the word he's going to use to describe that problem. For if you say God is a certain substratum bearing certain things as adjuncts, but this substratum is not like these adjuncts, right? The utmost of our apprehension would be on the basis of this belief, polytheism and nothing else. All you've just did was create a God who's made up of different parts, and you've created polytheism, right? For every substratum bearing this is undoubtedly, according to its definition, of duality. You're saying that there's a God and then there's his attributes, there's his description, even if it be one in its existence. For the notion of the substratum is different from that of the adjunct borne by it. Now, the demonstration of the impossibility of composition in him may be exalted, and to go even further, the demonstration of his absolute simplicity, which is extreme and ultimate, will be made clear to you in certain chapters of this treatise. In other words, later I'm going to describe to you why it's so important in other words, what's the problem? Maybe there is more than one, right? Maybe God is made up of constituent parts. Maybe polytheism isn't so bad, right? And Rambam is going to prove to us later why polytheism is so bad, right? But and why polytheism doesn't make sense and can't be, and why there has to be just one. But if we take that as understanding, then we cannot use positive attributes to refer to God. So now, I shall not say that he who affirms that God may be exalted has positive attributes either falls short of apprehending him, right? When I describe someone who makes this mistake and describes God with positive attributes, I'm not going to just say he's a guy that's kind of close, but he's just not quite there, right? Or maybe he's an associator, and maybe he's just a guy that believes in shituf, which I mean he believes in God and then other stuff, right, along with God, or has an apprehension of him that is different from what he really is, right? In other words, he understands God, but he doesn't have a full understanding. He understands God, but a little bit wrong. But I shall say that what actually happens is he has abolished his belief in the existence of the deity without being aware of it. He doesn't realize it. When he says God is almighty and all powerful, what he really is saying is he doesn't believe in God at all, although he himself, Rambam is not accusing him of deliberately doing that. But in essence, that's what's happening. He's actually denying belief in God, period. To make this clear, let me make it clear what I just said, Rambam says, because I know that it's gonna make some people a little nervous. He who falls short of the apprehension of the true reality of some matter is one who apprehends part of it and is ignorant of another part. What's the definition of a person who doesn't really understand something, right? If a guy walked up to you and said, I'm an expert carpenter, right? I can, or he's a physicist, right? But I only know this, but not that, right? He can only describe to you part of how these particles work, but not all of it. But he doesn't know it, right? To comprehend something, you have to comprehend the whole thing, right? For instance, Rambam said before that in the essence of a man is an animal with rationality, right? Let's say you have a guy that knows that man is an animal, but he has no idea that man has any rational process of thought, right? So all he's described to you is an ape, right? That person doesn't understand what a man is, what makes a man special. You don't say that he has he has a partial understanding. You say he doesn't get it, right? He doesn't believe it, because the point of man is that it's a rational thinking animal, right? So now there is no multiplicity in the true reality of the existence of God may be exalted. In God, there is no multiplicity. There isn't parts, right? So that one thing pertaining to him might be understood while another remains unknown. It can't be that I could understand part of God, but not the other part. There isn't such thing as parts. It doesn't exist. There is just God, finished. In a similar way, an associator with reference to a certain thing is one who represents to himself the true reality of a certain essence, as this essence veritably is, and affirms of another essence that its true reality is like that of the first essence. If a guy wants to describe and compare an associator, meaning a person who says, I know God because I can understand and compare him to something else. Well, if you're doing that on other things in this world, you could say, right, I can describe this table because I can also describe, another table that's very similar, and therefore I can understand this one. Now, in the opinion of those who think that the attributes in question exist, if you think that God has attributes, these attributes are not the essence of the deity, but rather their notions superadded to the essence. Those attributes don't describe the essence of God himself. They describe attributes that he has. Furthermore, one who has an apprehension of a thing that is different from what that thing really is must yet necessarily apprehend something of it as it really is, right? If you do find someone who, let's say, knows a little bit about physics, so he can understand a little bit of the thing, right? But in God, you can't know a little bit of God, because that means you're dividing him in parts. So, however, I shall not say of him who represents to himself that taste is a quantity. If a guy comes to you and says, right, that the way a thing tastes is a number, can be measured in 1, 2, 3, 4, right? I don't say that guy has a representation of different from what the latter really is, but rather I should say he is ignorant of the being of taste. He doesn't understand what taste is at all. So a guy that tries to explain God by saying, I know parts of it, I know a little bit of God, doesn't get the whole point. The whole point is that God doesn't have parts, right? So it's just like saying that if a guy walked into you and said, this drink is a 2, it tastes like a 2, right? Or he just says, this drink tastes like the color green. Like, what does that even mean, right? I'm leaving out some unusual genetic syndromes that people taste colors, assuming most people, right? So you don't think the guy only knows it a little bit. You think he just doesn't get it. He doesn't understand what you mean when you said taste. This is a very subtle speculation. Understand it. Think about what I'm saying. So if a guy comes to you and says that I know God a little bit, he doesn't realize what he's saying, but what he's saying is that he doesn't even know God at all. He doesn't really even believe in God at all. If he thinks that you can know a little bit about God, then he doesn't get it at all, because you can't know a little bit of something which is not quantifiable, which is just one simple essence. Okay, so that's the point that Rambam had to make. In accordance with this elucidation, I'm going to read this small paragraph, and we may, you shall know that he is incapable of apprehending the deity and is far removed from knowledge of him, who has no clear understanding of the necessity of negating with respect to God, a notion negated by someone else on the basis of a demonstration. And as we have made clear in the beginning of this chapter, the fewer negations there are on his part, the more his apprehension falls short, right? So the only way to understand God, in other words, is through negation. And a guy that doesn't go through the process of negation is really far back in the beginning of the process. Remember his story of the ship. He's back up there where basically all he knows is that there's a ship, right? And he doesn't even know what a ship is, doesn't know squat about the ship, but he knows there's such a notion as a ship. So a person that's like this knows that there's a notion called God, and that's it. That's his only knowledge. But those of us that try to work past that get closer and closer to a knowledge of God. As for one who affirms an attribute of him without knowing a thing about it except the mere term, it may be considered that the object to which he imagines the term applies is a non-existent notion, right? Let's say you have a person who all he knows is it's a ship, right? So he doesn't know anything other than that there is such a notion as a ship. But in our case, he knows nothing other than that there is a notion of God. But in his mind, what he's imagining is something that doesn't actually exist. Whatever flies through his brain, right? If you knew nothing about ships, and I just told you there's such a thing called a ship, what would go through your mind? Who knows? Anything, a ladder, a bird, any notion could go through your mind. All you know is there's such a concept. You know nothing else, right? An invention that is false. So this guy is walking around. I know there's a God, but I know nothing, zero about him. So the kinds of things that he can imagine could be all kinds of stuff. Applied to this term, a notion lacking existence, as nothing in existence is like that notion, right? He applied this term. For an example of that is a man who heard the term elephant, right? A guy hears there's an elephant, right? And all he knows is that it's an animal. So he wants to know the shape and the reality of the animal. So thereupon, one who is himself mistaken or one who misleads others, another guy who either doesn't know squat or another guy who knows, but he just likes playing around with people games, right? So he tells them, oh, I'll tell you what an elephant is. It's an animal that possesses one leg and 3 wings. It inhabits the depths of the sea. It has a transparent body and a broad face like that of a man in its form of a shape. It talks like a man. Sometimes it flies in the air, and sometimes it swims like a fish, right? Because all he knows is the notion of an elephant. So whatever you describe it with, it could be anything crazy, thing like that. I will not say that this representation of the elephant differs from what the latter really is. If you and I, who know what an elephant is, right, we're not going to say that, oh, this is his representation of elephant is something else, right? Nor that the man in question falls short in its apprehension to say, no, oh, he has only a small understanding of what an elephant is. Like, yeah, he gets it a little bit, right? But I shall say that the thing he has imagined as having his attributes is merely an invention and is false. And there's nothing in existence like that, right? That's what I would say. But that it is a thing lacking existence to which a term signifying an existent thing has been applied, right? So I would simply say that it's crazy, right? He's thinking of a beast that doesn't exist, and the term that he's applying doesn't at all apply, right? And he doesn't have even the remotest understanding of what an elephant is. Or a thing like Anka Mugrib, which is an Arabic name for some sort of a fabulous bird, say, for example, like a phoenix or something, or a centaur, or other imaginary forms of this kind to which a term simple or compound signifying some existent thing has been applied. In the present case, the matter is similar and of the same kind. When a person who all he knows is the term God and tries to give attributes to it, Like it's like describing an elephant as a flying beast with one leg and three wings, right? He's describing God with things that have absolutely no application to God, right? May praise is an existence whose existence has been demonstrated to be necessary, right? In other words, God is we know that his existence is necessary. And as I shall demonstrate from his being the necessarily existent, right? There necessarily follows his absolute simplicity. It has to be the case. And this is a philosophical subject that he's going to demonstrate later. It has to be that God is one. It has to be that God is not dividable into parts. So a person who describes it with attributes is like describing an elephant in all these crazy ways. As for thinking that the simple essence, whose existence, as has been said, is necessary, is endowed with attributes and with other notions accompanying it, the thing thus imagined cannot, as has been demonstrated, be existent in any respect. The thing that has attributes, right, is something that cannot possibly be, right? Accordingly, if we say that this essence, which for the sake of example shall be called a deity, we'll call it God, right, is an essence in which subsist many notions that are predicated of it, we apply this term to absolute non-existence. That absolutely cannot possibly be. Consider accordingly how great is the danger in affirming with reference to him positive attributes. Now I describe to you why it's so dangerous to describe God with positive attributes, because you're describing something that simply does not exist. It's impossible to exist. It can't exist, and it leads you to polytheism. Accordingly, it behooves us to believe with regards to the attributes figuring in the revealed books. He's reminding you that when we do find it in the Torah or the books of the prophets, that all of them are mentioned only to direct the mind towards nothing but his perfection, to help lead us in the right direction, or that they are attributes referring to the actions proceeding from him, which would describe that as we have made clear. No, so either it's leading us in that direction, or it's describing our experience of the actions of God and what they feel like to us, as opposed to actual attributes. So I know he's getting high into philosophical stuff, but I think that the overall idea is that if you describe God with attributes, then it's avodah zarah, right? It's polytheism, which is an extremely powerful notion, because as we all know, we do describe God with attributes. So it's really important, according to the Rambam, that when we do it, we remember what we mean. And if we make the mistake of thinking, when we call God Avinu Malkeinu, our Father, our King, if we start imagining fathers and kings in our mind, we have to be really, really careful. At least the Rambam was going to warn us that we have to be really careful.
Maybe that's the reason we say it only in a minion. The 13 attributes.
That's a good, interesting thought. Yeah. So like it's not that the 13 attributes specifically only in certain contexts, because if we just babbled them all the time, who knows where our brains would go. Yeah, go ahead.
I have a question. Maybe it's such a simple question. I'll embarrass myself, but
that's okay.
So let's talk about my mother, and I want to call my mother kind mother. Why? Because her actions towards me and towards other people that I've ever seen in interactions were always kind.
Right. So
in terms of the language, it's her actions that lead me to call my mother kind. And I'm trying to think whether Maimonides is saying, well, you can't do that. You shouldn't do it vis-a-vis God, because so you shouldn't say a kind God, but I don't see the difference between thinking of God as kind and thinking that my mother is kind.
Well, the only difference is that with your mother, you can say she's kind, right? You can say that I experience kindness, right?
Right.
But you can also say that she as a person has this attribute, this character trait of kindness.
Right.
Right. Which is an actual affirmative descriptor of her character. Right.
Because the actions that emanate from her.
Right. I mean, but through those actions, you can derive that she actually possesses a character trait called kindness. Right.
Okay.
Right. It's the same way if a person, not your mother, presumably, a ruffian in the street comes over and grabs your wallet and punches you in the face. Right. And it's a really strong punch. Right. So you can surmise that if he punched you that hard, he's probably strong, right? So you describe him as strong.
Okay.
So the action of the punch leads you to believe it leads you to conclude something about that person's essence, a quality that that person has, right?
Right.
But whereas with God, we have to remember that we may experience, hopefully very rarely, but we may experience a punch once upon a time in our day, right? And we experience it as anger, right? So then we may describe God as angry, right? Okay. But we have to remember that whereas in a person who gets mad and throws something at you, you can actually describe them as having anger, right? Okay. With God, he's not angry, right? What we experienced was something that feels to us like an angry God. You have to differentiate that. Okay. Your example of bringing an actual person into it is a good one because it helps us define what Rambam is trying to accomplish. And as human beings, we personalize God. We make God a personal God, and we interact with him, and we want to interact with him in a way that that's familiar to us and that feels close to us. And the Rambam is pointing out that it's dangerous. Well,
let me ask a variation.
Yeah.
Am I on safer grounds in describing God in a negative form and saying God is not unkind?
Yes, you're much safer. That's exactly the point. And I see you've been listening, right? That's
understanding.
Right. As long as you're, but the thing is though, is that someone listening to you off the cuff and not having really thought about it and not would think, oh, that's just a cop-out.
Right.
Right. The reason why Rambam wrote this chapter and he's driving it in farther and farther is because he realizes that you might think that, oh yeah, he's just saying we don't know. Okay. Ha. Like, how great is that? How genius is that? Right? A guy that can come to me and describe God. Ooh, that's a great man. He just that guy knows God. But the guy that comes by and just says we can't know him, right? That's not so great.
He's a great scholar,
right? But if Rambam comes by and says, that's all a bunch of baloney, we can't understand God, we can't describe God, right? That's pretty simple thought. That doesn't take any genius to say. But Rambam is telling us absolutely not, just the opposite. That the more you negate, the more you know about the world, the more knowledge you obtain, and the more you understand that God is beyond that, the more you understand God. And so that when we say God is not something, that's a tremendously powerful statement. And that's how we get to know him better. That's how eventually you get as close as possible to knowing the actual form of the ship. In his example.
I'm not a linguist, but if I said to a linguist, is there any difference between saying X is kind and X is not unkind? He would say those are identical expressions.
Well, Rambam specifically disagreed with that, right? Okay. He specifically said that when you say that a person is not unkind, you're not describing the essence of God at all. Okay. And when you say that a person is kind, you are describing their essence, right? When I say that you're not unkind, all I said is that there's no unkindness in you. And that is true about God, right? That's a true statement. If I say God is kind, that is not a true statement.
Why is it true God is not unkind? Why are you so?
Because you didn't describe God's essence at all.
Okay.
He said that last week, right? That when you use negations, you're not describing his essence.
Right.
And that's good because we can't. Because there's no way a human being can ever understand that.
So it's kind of you're eliminating all possibilities by going the negative route.
Yes. Now, if you think about it, the more you know, right, the more negatives you've just accumulated, right?
Right.
The person that doesn't know about the beauty of a flower, for example, and he thinks about God's beauty, he might imagine in his mind something like a flower, right? Mm-hmm. But if you know the beauty of the flower and you see it and you experience it, and then you say that God's beauty is so much beyond that, it's so different in its very nature from that I can't even describe it that way. That's a very powerful idea, Like what we experience as beauty, this is just earthly things, no matter how amazing it gets, or no matter how awful it gets, right? It's still nothing in comparison to God. We're open for more comments if there are any. And next week we're going to talk about the names of God, right? And we're going to spend a couple chapters on God's names. Okay, so it's going to be really interesting, and how Rambam demonstrates that these names of God actually indicate many of the characteristics that Rambam is talking about. Like, you might think, because usually a name you think of as something that describes the nature of a person, right, or a thing, right? In Hebrew especially, the name usually has some meaning. It describes the essence of the thing itself. So how does it work when we name God if we can't describe God's essence? And Rambam is going to demonstrate to us that it's the opposite of what we thought. But we'll get there next week. All right. So if there's no other comments, we'll stop it here. And thank you for joining. And Bli Neder, I'll have another laptop with a better camera next week. All right. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.